Everyone who considers Christianity brings heartfelt questions and intellectual objections born out of real-life experiences. They're looking for answers, but even more, they're looking for a safe place to ask their questions. Join me as I meet with a group of people who don't believe in the Christian faith to discuss 6 of the most common objections to Christianity. Welcome to The Reason for God. Welcome back to our 4th session together. We're discussing tonight the topic, why does God allow suffering? Why is there so much evil in the world? This is a big philosophical question for a lot of people. A lot of people believe it really poses a huge barrier to belief in God. It's also, though, a very personal issue. It functions, I think, on 2 levels. And I don't know anybody who hasn't struggled with the idea emotionally and existentially, how could there be a God if there's all this? However, I think I'd like to start by putting it in a philosophical form, if that's okay. And it goes like this. Here's the difficulty. Given evil and suffering, if God's all-powerful, then he probably doesn't care enough to stop it, so he's not loving. Or if God's all-loving and he wants to stop it, then he must not be all-powerful. But if you have an all-powerful, all-loving God, which is what the Bible says, existing, then there shouldn't be evil. But there is evil, therefore, that God can't exist. So let me just start with that question. Do you think that makes the case? Do you think evil and suffering pretty much disproves the very existence of God? What do you think?
I would pretty much say yes. I think that's a big thing for me. Because, like you mentioned, if God is omnipotent, if he is all powerful, all ruling, then he either pretty much chooses not to save everyone or eliminate evil, or he can't. And if he chooses not to, he's not benevolent. But if he chooses, or I guess if he chooses not to, he's not I can't tongue twister. If he chooses not to, he's not benevolent. I can't say that word right now. Anyway, he's not loving.
Yeah.
If he chooses not to, he's not loving. And if he is loving, then he can't save everyone. So it really comes down to that for me.
So you're convinced by that pretty much?
Almost entirely, yeah.
I think at the logical level, the answer is yes, it's a problem. Because Christianity does make, I think, 4 claims which, as a package, are in conflict with each other. It says that God is a personal God who hears petitionary prayer. He is good, and he is omnipotent, and there is evil. And any explanation of evil, at some level, compromises on one of those or more of those 4 things, that he's omnipotent, good, a personal God, and that there is evil. So at a logical level, I think it is a problem.
I think the existence of suffering, it kind of leads to like the 2 least satisfactory explanations for me. One of them is God has a plan and we can't understand the existence of suffering. That's a non-starter for me. You have to do a better job than that. And then the second one is,
try.
Yeah, because there's just like a blanket answer for virtually anything that we can't think through or discuss.
That's fair.
And so it's a very easy crutch, I think. And I think the second one is there is a purpose for your suffering. I think that's also a very unsatisfactory answer, at least for me, because when you see how random the suffering, at least it seems to be, and how our sense of justice doesn't really seem to line up with what we observe, the idea that there might be a purpose, I think it just seems very unfair. There's something like instinctively unfair about that.
The problem is the benevolence claim that Christianity makes at the logical level. I mean, if anyone else went around killing people or maiming them at birth or spreading cancer, you would have said that was a very bad person.
Or even allowing it to exist if they have the power to stop it.
But God does all those things.
Right, that's what I mean.
Exactly.
So I was kind of feeding off of what you're saying.
That's the problem with why shouldn't there be suffering. If Christianity didn't make the goodness claim about God, then it would be easier.
And also, what if some people's suffering leads to other people's happiness? Like let's say, if it's a divorce in a family, maybe the kids suffer, but maybe it leads to the parents' happiness. So maybe some people need to suffer in order for other people to be happy. And maybe later on in life, coming from like a karma point of view, it'll all lead back to, another reaction that will lead to non-suffering for the other people.
That's my, I always think that these things are personal choices that, I think Buddhists and Hindus both believe that given a specific action, people choose to either see it as a positive or negative, outcome. And I think given sometimes more information, people's perspective on an action changes. That at a local level, personal family member passes away. That's a tragedy. It's personal suffering, but maybe through study of that person's disease, I just want to throw in a personal thing that today I heard a piece of classical music, Metamorphosen by Richard Strauss, which is written right at the end of the Second World War. And it's this beautiful piece that expresses all this suffering of a collective group of people, but it's for the bombing of Dresden, for a German city that went down at the end, and nothing about the Jews or the Allies or anything. But it's a beautiful piece of music.
Just two things, two ideas. The only religion that says God actually came into this world and suffered excruciatingly, and identified with us and suffered along with us all the things that we've suffered. One part of the Bible actually says that. See, assuming the Christianity is true for a second, we still don't know what the reason for suffering is. God doesn't tell us. But now we know what the reason for suffering isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us, and it can't be that he could just snap his fingers and let it all go away and still have us. So in other words, if he loves us enough to suffer for us, then he must have a good reason for allowing it to go on. You see, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, if he came down here to suffer for us, I would like to know why he doesn't just stop it. I don't know why he doesn't just stop it, but the coming and suffering, granting them my premise, the coming and suffering means that he must have some good reasons. It can't just be he's remote and doesn't care.
I think those are just powerful premises. If those are true, then obviously I would agree, but it's so tough to know if those premises have any meaning behind them or if they're just ideas.
This idea of a suffering God being unique, I don't think it's unique at all. I think we all suffer, and if God has suffered, then welcome to life.
I feel like we're talking and defining these terms in a Christian context, and I guess within my head, I'm not interfacing with it differently. Because when the question is asked, why does God allow suffering, my first thought is, why not? I mean, coming from sort of maybe a Buddhist and Taoist background, suffering is life. That's a given. So there's no reason to question why it's there or even to extricate it from your life. And that applies to the term evil too. Of course, we've got to understand what we mean by these terms. I think that's a big problem. But if there's evil in the world, in my opinion, there's good in the world. And you can't take one out or the other. It's not possible.
Can you explain what you believe, how you believe suffering to be or how significant it is? I guess I'm not really understanding where you're coming from. Yeah.
In terms of suffering, in terms of what it is for me, there's a sort of scientific way also to look at it, although I think it's more Taoist, which is to say that I think all this suffering, good and evil are words we put to sort of a feeling of happiness or positivity, something good, concepts. And that's sort of happens as a result of, it's like if you work hard, then you sort of get a reward of sort of a good feeling, a result of it. And if you don't, then you don't. There's sort of just a yin-yang. There's sort of a counterbalance of dynamics that go on. And suffering is just sort of something that happens in the world. There's a struggle. Maybe it's a better word to say it. There's struggle. There's work that builds up to a point, and then at some point you take a vacation or there's some benefit that you get from it. And so there's sort of that kind of notion. That's how I understand suffering a little bit.
So there's nothing inherently positive or negative? It's all in how you react?
Well, if positive means there's sort of a release, there's sort of a benefiting from work or benefiting from discipline, then that would be a general positive thing. But sort of getting into the good and evil world is a little more loaded for me, I guess. And that's why it's a little hard for me to interface with it.
As a pastor, when I'm sitting with people who are going through incredible suffering, the idea that if you could see it somehow, this is all part of the way things are, kind of trivializes it. I found. Yet I do know plenty of people, from a Buddhist point of view, an Eastern point of view, who have handled suffering with Eastern meditation and Eastern perspective. I know that. I do also wonder sometimes whether that trivializes the evil of the evil.
For me, the word suffering actually, my immediate jump is sort of to a Buddhist context definition of it, and I'm not clear if that's what is meant here. And evil is a very problematic concept because I don't know if I actually believe in it necessarily, certainly in a way that I think a Christian would define it. And therefore also, I don't think our intention is to get rid of evil. I think it exists in balance with good, and you sort of resolve, get rid of one, more of the other increases, but it always kind of comes back to a certain balance.
I think as a skeptic, I do not explain the existence of evil and suffering. I think it's something that we have to deal with. I think in our daily lives, the best thing is to actually try and do something about it. And the worst possible thing is to simply be indifferent.
What about like self-imposed suffering? Like that was like one thing that I was thinking of, suffering that's self-imposed, like someone that gets lung cancer because they smoked for 30 years, or someone who, recklessly spends their money and gambles, and then they have to file for bankruptcy. Like suffering that, sometimes you go to the church, but it's obviously self-imposed.
But then it's only self-imposed for you if you're dying of cancer. But your brother, your sister, your parents, for all of them, it's not. So you're part of it. You very often have an active role in some suffering, but most of the suffering is happening to the people around you.
For me, when you listen to somebody who's lived through the Holocaust or what have you, and you listen to their story, and this is a very personal thing, it's like a tear's been made in the fabric of the universe, and there's nothing this side of the tear that can sew it up again.
Let me propose a way to think about this, and tell me what you think. 6 years old. 6-year-olds suffer because they see things happen. Very often they can't understand what their parents are doing, which their parents are disciplining them in some way, or maybe moving them out of town. They never see their friends again. They feel unhappy, inconsolable, filled with grief, and I think they suffer as much as anybody who's as upset as they can be. But we also know by the time they get to be 25 or 30, they look back and they know they really suffered, but now they have a perspective. They realize why some of those things happen. Or even if they were bad things, they get past them because they're able to get a bigger perspective. If there was a God, why couldn't we all be 6 years old spiritually? Or even worse, I mean, the difference between a 6-year-old and a 30-year-old, as different as that is, it'd be far greater to be a human being and then maybe in heaven and seeing things differently. Why couldn't we all be 6 years old? And the reason I'm putting it this way is I don't want to say, oh, I'm sure. I don't see any purpose in this stuff either. I can't even begin to say, I'm sure there's some kind of reason, behind the Holocaust, that God's working some kind of good. So I don't want to try to guess. I think it's awful. I do think it's insulting to guess. And yet at the same time, I wonder whether it's possible we're all 6 years old, and it would be possible to have a perspective on which everything we look at would be like the grief of a 6-year-old. What do you all think of that? I love it, I hate it, I'm never coming back. It helps a little. Or some other.
I think it helps, because I think the 6-year-old feels suffering because they can't predict the outcome of their actions. They do something and all of a sudden they just realize dad's yelling at them or mom's upset. There's a confusion that happens, but they were simply acting. I think as they get older, they contextualize their actions. I think that's what happens. That's how I see things in general. Things happen and we suffer, I think, and then later we gain understanding about what that suffering was.
I think whenever you're suffering hardship, and I guess I'll make it personal. I grew up in a very Christian family. My parents are still very Christian, and so if they see that I'm struggling with something or there are challenges in my life, they explain it by saying there's a greater purpose. And yeah, there might be, but I find that to be a very limited explanation. It doesn't really comfort me, especially because what you want at that moment is alleviation. You don't want some grand explanation of why this is happening to you.
Another thing I do sometimes, which probably isn't the best way of handling things, is just to sweep it under the rug and just try and forget about it. Just cross it out of my mind and pretend it never happened. And that's one way that I can usually deal with suffering.
There was a guy named Horatio Spafford, 1870s. All four of his little girls died in a boating accident. It was an ocean liner. 1873 goes down. So it's all of his children. He writes a hymn called It Is Well With My Soul. I don't know if any of you ever heard it. And it's all about the cross and about Jesus. And what's intriguing to me is you'd think that he would work through his grief, and it was very, very helpful to him. It really helped him through. But it's all about Jesus dying on the cross. And I used to wrestle with why in the world would this have helped him? It's all about Jesus. But I realized two things that happen when you suffer. One is sometimes you think, I'm being punished. But the cross says, no, Jesus took your punishment if granting the premise. The second question comes up, well, maybe God doesn't care. But the cross says God does care. In fact, he's lost a child out of his love for you. I mean, that's, again, granting the premise. So here's a guy who had real suffering. And the idea that God comes into the world in Jesus Christ and suffers even though he doesn't give you the answers, but that proves that he loves us, it's pretty functional.
Which brings us to, the comforting aspect and how people turn to God in a time of suffering. And you mentioned the story about the daughters and everything, and the man finding strength from God. And it really comes down to, is it really just a magnificent and wonderful coping mechanism? Is it this thing that people find strength in and find love in times of, great sadness? I'm not saying I'm against it, or I'm not saying I support it. I'm saying it works. And I'm not sure if it works because it's real or because it works.
If we're putting the lens of, is Christianity a coping mechanism, my question here is, what isn't a coping mechanism ultimately? Because, it's a coping mechanism because we believe it's maybe not true, and we're using these stories to help us get through the day. But, as a science person, who understood the history of Newtonian physics, was disproved in some ways. It only works within certain contexts. It was technically a coping mechanism until we figured out, stuff Einstein brought in and stuff that is in quantum level. So I don't know. I feel like in many ways, not to trivialize it, what isn't technically a coping mechanism?
How did I feel about suffering God in Christianity? It actually made me think that it is a unique aspect of Christianity. From what I know about all the other religions I've studied, it seems that is something that is unique. And I actually felt it might be a useful thing to help somebody get through a tragedy. It seemed like we need that. We need to feel that there are people, or there's a force or some being that can empathize and go through these things with us. I think that's something I realized in my own life. And it seems like if Christianity can offer that might be a useful thing to think about.
I think I need to wrap up. Let me give you a poem that vividly gets across the distinctive way in which Christianity can give you a handle on evil and suffering. It's by, I hope I can remember it, but it's only the last stanza. It's by a man named Edward Shillito, and it goes like this. The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to thy throne. To our wounds, only God's wounds can speak, and no God has wounds but thou alone. That's getting across the idea that Jesus on the cross is a God with wounds, and there's really nothing that speaks to my wounds over the years as much as God's wounds has. So, thank you for coming. You gave me lots to think about. I hope I gave you a lot to think about. And thanks for being here, and see you next time.
Thank you.